And it's a beautiful thing too. Hold up. Yay.
Hey, welcome to Three Count Commentaries. So there was a video by Jim Cornette where he was asked a question by a Cult of Cornette member. Who the question was, who is more influential in the long term, Eric Bischoff or Paul Heyman? And Jim Cornette's answer was Paul Heyman, due to the amount of people who were doing high spots and the cruiserweight wrestling and the death matches and that kind of being very indie-rific and that sort of thing. And that makes Paul Heyman be very influential. And to be quite honest, I think I just wanted to weigh in. I'm not going to disagree wholly. I just want to weigh in on this because I've looked at a lot of these stuff from both of these guys. I've read books on both of them. I've read articles on both of them. I have listened to both of them ad nauseum talk about their philosophies and different things like that. So before we get into talking about what makes them the most influential or who's the most influential of the two, first thing we have to do is talk about all the crap they stole, because or things they should not get credit for, right? Now, everybody takes ideas. Starrcade was the precursor to WrestleMania. Nobody will ever deny that. But Starrcade and WrestleMania were definitely two different shows, right? Vince took the Starrcade idea of the closed circuit pay-per-view event, even though, to be quite honest, even Starrcade wasn't the first one to do it. Vince J. McMahon had a closed circuit pay-per-view, the Inoki versus Muhammad Ali disaster. That was on closed circuit, if I remember correctly. That was before Starrcade. That was in 1976, right? And it wouldn't be up for almost 10 years before Vince would try it with WrestleMania. That would be after Starrcade. So sometimes you are inspired by somebody to do something, Starrcade, WrestleMania. Then there's other times where things were already going on and you just took it to the next level. And this is a lot of this is what Bischoff and Heyman did. For instance, Bischoff gets a lot of credit for the cruiserweight division. Oh, look what he did with Rey Mysterio and Psychosis and Juventud Guerrera and the Ultimo Dragon and all these guys. Again, understand, WCW had a cruiserweight division when Eric Bischoff got there. When Eric Bischoff got to WCW in like 1991, WCW already had a cruiserweight division. It was called the light heavyweight division. Brian Pillman and Tom Zink and Raven under the name Scotty Flamingo. All of those guys were in that division. And they were selling it. If you watch the first 5 or 6 episodes of WCW Saturday Night, it's almost completely light heavyweight division stuff. And it's Pillman as the champion, talking about, defending his light heavyweight title against the most agile, fast-paced opponents. All Bischoff did was rebrand the light heavyweight title, which didn't last very long. They kind of got rid of it. All he did was rebrand it and diversify it by adding Japanese wrestlers and adding Mexican wrestlers. That's really all he did. The title, it could have been a direct successor if he wanted it to. All he did was rebrand it and add things to it. Paul Heyman gets a lot of credit for deathmatch wrestling. Oh, he popularized deathmatch wrestling. No. Eastern Championship Wrestling, before Paul Heyman even got there, had death matches. And Eddie Gilbert, who was the booker before Paul Heyman showed up, he was brought specifically to Philly to bring the Memphis-style brawls to Philadelphia. And if you remember, the Onita, Dark Side of the Ring, and all that kind of stuff, they were inspired by the Memphis wrestling style. So Paul Heyman stole from the FMW, Onita and all them, all that crazy barbed wire stuff, exploding ring stuff. They did steal a lot of that stuff. But that stuff was inspired by Memphis, and they were already doing it in Eastern Championship Wrestling before Paul Heyman got there. And if you ever watched ECW, early ECW, Eastern Championship Wrestling, you will see the Funks and barbed wire matches, guys bleeding all over the place, the Axel Rottens and all those guys beating each other half to death every week. That stuff was already there before Paul. What Paul did was take it to the next level. You know, he just took something that already existed and took it to the next level. So he shouldn't get any credit for the death matches. It was already there. Just like the cruiserweight division was already there. Now, another thing with Bischoff is Bischoff stole the NWO. Everybody knows that, right? WCW had a partnership with New Japan Pro Wrestling. Bischoff was friendly with New Japan. He was in Japan, saw the invasion angle that they had done in 1994, 1995. There was an invasion angle with UWF and New Japan Pro Wrestling. It wasn't the first invasion angle they've ever done. They had done some before this, because that was a big thing with Japan, with New Japan especially. They would fight outsiders, invaders. But this was a pretty big one because it led to Bischoff doing the NWO. That's all Bischoff did, was take what he saw in Japan, and he literally had people believe that the WWF was invading WCW. He had people believing that to the point where WWF had to sue him to stop doing it. Stop, trying to use us to advertise for your show. We are not invading you. Tell your audience we are not invading you. This was in the Nitro book. Bischoff does not deny that he stole the idea from New Japan. He also does not deny that he was using WWF implicitly, not explicitly, implicitly, covertly, to promote WCW. That's what he was doing. So the entire idea was stolen. The only thing he really did that was fresh was the Sting idea. Okay? So, and Goldberg. So when you don't give guys credit for the things that they didn't come up with, that question gets a lot harder. Which one was more influential? Because they both still are very influential, as far as, especially from a TV production standpoint when it comes to Bischoff. The slick production of Nitro, the stretching it to 2 hours, some of the business things that he did, focus on the 18 to 49 demographic, raising the amount of pay-per-views that he did. Again, Turner, the focus on television is a big one because Turner owned TV networks. He didn't own pay-per-view providers. So Bischoff, his job was to make Turner happy. So he would do big matches on TV, not just because he didn't know how to book and he was hot-shotting. That was part of it. The other part of it is that Turner owned TV networks, not pay-per-view providers. So have your big matches on TV. And that was his philosophy. When you look at Paul Heyman, look at what he was able to do with a lot of wrestlers that nobody wanted. What he was able to make, he allowed such freedom that guys were able to go out there and get themselves over, make themselves stars, tell their own stories, and essentially do whatever they wanted. It was a creative utopia in ECW. You very rarely hear about Paul Heyman putting the boot on somebody's neck and not letting them get over. You very rarely hear that stuff. Paul, because he was almost like, I hate to use this analogy, but I think it's really apt, how slave diets kind of grew up out of necessity. Like they start eating the innards of the pigs and all that kind of stuff because they didn't have access. They were eating the scraps because they didn't have access to the good parts. That's kind of how Heyman was. Heyman didn't have access to Sting or Luger or Shawn or Brett. So he had to make the most of the Sandman, make the most of Raven, make the most of 56-year-old Terry Funk, make the most of, the cruiserweights that you do have, the lighter heavyweight guys. And sure, Bischoff stole a lot of those guys. We'll get into that in a moment. But he was prompted to make the most of the talent that he did have. When you look at, take somebody like Scott Levy, for instance. Scott Levy worked in all three promotions. If you don't know who Scott Levy is, I'm just about to tell you. When he was in WWF, he was Johnny Polo. Who is Johnny Polo? Don't know. When he was in WCW, he was Scotty Flamingo, which was just another way. That's just another name for Johnny Polo. Johnny Polo and Scotty Flamingo was essentially the same character. That it was a stuffy white kid, rich as hell, spoiled brat, who, and he gets to ECW and he's Raven. Completely different character. Raven is a cult leader. Like the presentation of just that one guy. He took one guy. Like Scott Levy, you see him on TV and he's wearing neon pink. And he's got like Jerry curl stuff in his hair. He's rapping. He was rapping in WCW. It was crazy. And in WWF, he had like a riding stick, like a polo player, like a polo stick or whatever. But then he goes to ECW. He dyes his hair. He starts wearing these really cool grunge jackets, and he really just kind of absorbs himself into that scene. Becomes somebody completely different. And you see that again and again. Shane Douglas. Look at how Shane Douglas was presented in early WCW. He was a white meat babyface. He had no personality whatsoever. He goes to the WWF. He had the same exact thing. White meat babyface, no personality whatsoever. He goes to ECW. He becomes the franchise. He finds his voice. And he has a very unique voice. But he was broke. So then he leaves. He goes back to WWF. They make him Dean Douglas. Because he was actually a teacher. So they made him Dean Douglas. He got pissed. He went back. Okay, so when you look at these guys that Paul Heyman was able to get the most out of, these were literally the scraps of the Monday Night Wars. These were guys that these companies had fucked over and picked apart and bullied. Guys like Brian Pillman who had been kicked around forever. Guys like Steve Austin who had been kicked around forever. And then they go to ECW and they, just like that, they switch it around. That's Paul's brilliance. He found new ways of presenting also rans in a way where they can still seem like top guys. He was able to take scraps and make full-grown meals out of them. He was able to keep his promotion alive by doing that. Bischoff couldn't do that, right? Vince could do it when he actually took time to do it, but he didn't most of the time. He still doesn't most of the time. That is what Paul Heyman, he sees the potential in people. That's the one thing that Paul has over pretty much everybody, including Tony Khan, Dixie Carter, and most other people. Nobody sees your potential more than Paul Heyman. That's why everybody loves Paul. Okay? Because Paul can see something in you that other people do not see. And that's, the cult mindset. You could be so much better. Here's how we could fix what you got. Now, let's find out what's inside of you. Let's bring it out. That's what makes Paul very influential. Okay? Because he has been able to, switch and change things. Now, they both was able to do something really interesting with their shows. WCW, again, very slick, a little overproduced when it comes to nitros and stuff like that. Bischoff took WCW, a company that was mired in BS. Let's be quite honest. There was a lot of bullshit. There's a lot of stupid characters floating around. The Z-Man and a lot of the goofiness, like not Johnny Polo, but Scotty Flamingo, the Diamond Stud, Vinny Vegas. It was a lot of that ridiculous shit that they were doing in early WCW. Bischoff got rid of that stuff. He revamped it. Now, he did bring in some of the campy characters later, like Glacier and Mortis and, stuff like that. But he really tried to get away from that stuff. He did the Dungeon of Doom to make Hogan happy because that's what Hogan wanted, But he wanted to get away from that stuff. He wanted more of the stuff that was kind of like what a usual wrestling show is. You take reality, mix it with a little kayfabe, people believe it. That's why he was able to get away with the NWO thing. Instead of calling him Razor Ramon or giving him some silly name, Scott the Razor or some silly shit like that. Let's come out of Scott Hall, but he's going to do the Razor Ramon accent. He's going to do the toothpick. He's going to do the greasy hair, all the stuff that you know about Razor Ramon. He's going to do most of that. He can't do it all because then he'll get sued again. He's going to do most of it. and he's going to lead you to believe that he's still Razor Ramon, but we're just going to call him by a different name, or that he is Razor Ramon, but his real name is Scott Hall. Same thing they did with Kevin Nash. Introduce a little bit more realism. Now, Paul also mixed realism with his kayfabe, but Paul went into the subcultures. He started going into the grunge and the metal scene, because WCW and WWF was for kids. Okay, they had Doink the Clown, they had cartoon characters, they had Crush. You know, that's how Bischoff was able to get the advantage, is because he didn't present cartoon characters. When he stopped doing that, and Vince was still doing it, he was able to take full advantage of it. But Paul was able to have his advantage over both of them because they were both on television. There were limits to what they can do. They can't use licensed music. Paul Heyman can, because nobody cares what he does. He's on syndicated TV. He can play whatever song he wants. Nobody's going to sue him because nobody's watching this show except people who want to see it. So he's going into that and going into the subcultures. They're cussing on there. They're bleeding on there. WWF and WCW both had banned blood around the same time. It was partially Vince's idea to ban the blood, and he kind of put pressure on WCW to ban blood because they weren't doing like full on gig matches, but they had some blood. And so when you saw like Brett do a blade job, every time he did blades in the early part of the 90s, he wasn't supposed to be doing it. You know, Vince had already banned blood, and he had written articles and stuff about guys, you know, using razors and stuff in the ring, and he had pretty much it was him sticking it to WCW because he didn't give a shit really about guys bleeding, but he just didn't want WCW to have an unfair advantage. This is what I mean by when I say like capitalists will use the government against their opponents. Vince is one of those guys, and he was, hey, I think we should stop all this bleeding. You know, WCW, man, look at what they're doing. They have their wrestlers carving each other up. Look at these guys. Look at Dusty Rhodes' forehead. You know, he doesn't really give a shit. He just wants you to stop doing it because, you know, you're doing it a little too much and it's getting attention. He's taking attention away from what he's doing. He's a little bit more serious about that now because of sponsors and everything. But that was the problem then, too. ECW didn't have any sponsors. It was like PBS. It was like fully supported by viewers like you. You know, so they had to go out there and damn near kill themselves because if they don't sell tickets, they don't even have a show. They're not looking for Coca-Cola to come in and sponsor ECW. WCW was, which is why they stopped doing blood, which is why they didn't allow cursing, which is why standards and practices went absolutely nuts in WCW, and they eventually got to Vince too in the later, well, that would be the parent teachers councils and all this, the parents groups. They got Vince in the early 2000s after WCW had gotten killed. Vince started to relent on this kind of stuff, but Paul didn't have that stuff, so he was able to take advantage of being essentially an underground cult group that could do whatever they wanted, who could say whatever they wanted. And they went there. They did sacrifices. They did lesbian angles. It was very, very, very mature. If WWF was for kids, which it was, that's Vince's favorite audience. He always wanted to have the kid audience. That's why he went back to being PG after all of those years. Bischoff wanted the 18 to 49 demographic because he needs to be able to sell this crap that he's doing to advertisers. And he's having a very tough time doing it. So he's going to say, we're going to make this as palatable as possible to the college age students. Now, in today's world, 18 to 49 leads more towards the 49. Back then, it was more towards the 18. All right. So he wanted a little bit more of a mature audience. But Heyman, you had to be a straight up adult to watch ECW. Because there was blood everywhere. There was half naked women everywhere. Stuff that they were not doing on WCW and WWF. And that was just basically how they were able to get advantages over each other. It's basically like, you know, corporate philosophies. ECW was a corporation, even though they very small one. You know, they used the advantages that they had. And that's actually what made Paul very, very, very influential, is that he was able to make the most out of the little that he had. But Bischoff, I think Bischoff is way more influential, to be quite honest. Because when you look at Paul, what did Paul really do? Paul created essentially a fad organization, right? He created something that was never meant to last as long as it did. It was untenable that ECW would last 10 years. It just wasn't going to happen. Look at what they were doing. They couldn't pay people. They weren't even paying the talent. Right? So they weren't even paying the talent. They had all types of systems like season tickets and all kind of other weird things that they were doing to make money because the company could barely stay alive. That's why he ended up being in Vince's back pocket around, what was that, 97? He jumped in Vince's back pocket. Vince had lost a ton of money in 95. So Paul wasn't really all that influential. He ended up being essentially, doing favors for Vince and training guys down there and stuff like that. Taking talent that Vince didn't need anymore and putting a new coat of paint on him like Al Snow. And if I remember correctly, Al Snow said that he was being paid by the WWF the whole time he was in ECW. And he didn't want to go back. So there's stuff like that going on, which is why I take points off from Paul. He didn't really take care of, sure, Bischoff had Ted Turner's money. He was spending that shit like wow. He could deny it as much as he wants. He was spending that shit like wildfire. You know what I'm saying? He was chucking out huge contracts. He gave Hogan like $4 million plus percentages of the gate, plus percentages of pay-per-view. It was insane, the kind of stuff Hogan was getting. No wonder the company went out of business. No wonder the company had so much debt. Well, especially when they went drawing. The deal makes sense when you're making money. Doesn't make any sense at all once the gates start to fall off, once the pay-per-view buy rate starts to fall off, once the TV rating starts to fall off. Why are you paying this motherfucker $4 million to sit at home? But you're locked in the contract if you signed it. It's silly, it's stupid. But Bischoff did something that became essentially the standard for pro wrestling. And that is trying to make pro wrestling palatable to advertisers. The 18 to 49 demographic, focusing on that, being able to supply content that advertisers are willing to buy. Vince didn't care about that stuff. Like most people who buy into the WWE, they buy into the brand, right? And people say, "Oh, Vince doesn't care about stars. He only sells the brand." Vince has always sold the brand, always, because wrestlers come and go. They get hurt. They die. They quit. Sell the brand. He's always sold the brand. But he sells the brand plus the star. This is something that Dana White talks about. And a lot of people are, they talk about MMA fighter pay. And they don't care about stars in the UFC. They'll never let you be a star. All Dana White wants to do is talk about the brand. It's like, yeah, because these guys are independent contractors. At the end of their contract, they can go anywhere. They can do whatever they want. Why would you look at what happened to Vince when he let Hogan go, which, was partly his own fault when he shoved Hogan out the door. His company went into the toilet because Hogan left. So he's like, you know what? Never again. Ended up, the WWF and Steve Austin, WWF and The Rock, ended up being a big deal. But of course, you're going to push the brand. That's what Paul Heyman did that too. Get people to chant ECW, EC Dub, EC Dub. Yes, but so a lot of people think that Paul Heyman started that. That's why he incentivized the ECW chant, that he was putting the brand over the wrestlers. And he was, because he had to, again, for the same reason. These guys are going to leave Paul, They're out of here eventually because he can't pay them. So they're obviously going to leave. There's no top guy in ECW that didn't leave. Taz left. Sabu left multiple times. Shane Douglas left. Raven left. Sandman left. The only one that didn't leave was Rhino. He didn't have a chance to leave because the company went out of business right after he became the champion. Oh, Rob Van Dam didn't leave. And he had the opportunity to leave. He wrestled on Raw a few times, but he didn't leave. So, these guys, that was smart, put it in the brand over so Heyman didn't create that concept of putting the brand over the wrestlers. He didn't create that. Vince had been doing that shit already. He made sure everything Hulk Hogan had WWF on it, and you weren't going to see Hulk Hogan merchandise that didn't have WWF on it. So he made sure he got his on there, even if it was on a teddy bear. It was somewhere on there that said WWF. It wasn't just going to be a Hulk Hogan teddy bear, and it's just a Hulk Hogan teddy bear. That's ridiculous. Why would he do that? But the 18 to 49 demographic, focusing on that, making wrestling live. That was the most important thing. Because as we see today, that's pretty much what's keeping wrestling alive, is the fact that TV networks are willing to pay for live sports. That is what makes Bischoff the most influential. And it's not because of anything. That wasn't under his booking decisions. His booking decisions were mostly garbage. What made his most influential is the business aspect. That he decided to up the number of pay-per-views. Get rid of the clashes because you're paying, too much for that stuff. Try to generate as much money as you can in the pay-per-view market. He ended up, of course, overdoing it, which, he didn't really want to. But he ended up overdoing it. He focused on his television product because, again, Ted Turner owns TV networks, not pay-per-view providers. And he targeted a demographic that advertisers found more palatable. That's what he did. Vince was going after children. Now, children is a good demo, because they grow into the product. That's why most of us who watched wrestling as kids, our favorite wrestlers are like Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan. There's like 50-year-old guys who are like, man, I was a Hulkamaniac crazy as a kid. That's why WWE will never go anywhere, because it's everywhere. It's a John Cena kid now. There's going to be an entire 2 or 3 generations of John Cena kids, and people think that's a bad thing. It's not, because it gets people in. And if you don't stay, if you're 17, all of a sudden you want to watch New Japan, go ahead. He's already made money off of you. You either bought the pay-per-views, you bought the t-shirts, you bought the video games and all that kind of stuff. He doesn't care if you're now 38 years old and you don't want to watch Raw anymore. He doesn't give a shit. He already made money off you for 30 years. He don't care. He know you was watching Raw at 7. So he don't care. That's why he doesn't give a shit about these idiots that are in the AEW fan base. Because all of them are like 40-year-olds. You all grew up on Raw already. Your parents bought you the wrestling buddies and the video games and all that shit. Vince has made that. He's cashed those checks already. So you're 40 years old not wanting to give Vince any more money. Oh, I'm sure he's weeping. There's more 7-year-olds out there. He doesn't care. And that was his philosophy in the early 90s. It took for Bischoff to force him to change that, to focus on the teenagers, because people did grow out of wrestling. And people were growing out of wrestling faster. He was losing a demographic by focusing on kids. Like, you can't go too far with that stuff. And Bischoff reminded him of that. And it seems like Tony Khan's trying to remind him of that again. But that's what makes Bischoff more influential than Paul Heyman. Because Paul Heyman went too far. He went over the deep end, and he couldn't monetize ECW outside of tickets and pay-per-view and merchandise. Otherwise, he couldn't do anything. You need people to want to put you in buildings. They were tearing up buildings. They were tearing up cars in ECW. The fans were suing them. How you run a business where your fans are suing you? How are you running a business if your fans are suing you? It doesn't make sense. And Paul was doing that shit all the time. He's a shit businessman. And since this is a wrestling business, the more influential person was Eric Bischoff. And I know a lot of people don't like that, but I'm looking at it objectively. The wrestling business wouldn't be what it is today without Eric Bischoff. We still might have been okay without Paul. It wouldn't be shit without Eric. Because with the taped Raws, the taped Raw was doing pretty well. In the ratings, there was no need for them to ever change that format. When Nitro came in and was live every single week and was giving away the results of Raw because they had him somehow. I think they probably got him like the dirt sheets or something like that, and he was able to give them away. And then they learned over time, hey, we make more money if this thing is live. Hey, we might be able to advertise this thing better if we focused on teenagers and not children and not full-grown adults. This might make a little bit more sense where, then of course they started using the WWF as a gateway drug, which is what AEW does. It's like, oh yeah, sure, you watched that as a kid, but this is where the big boys play, right? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, right? And I think a lot of Eric Bischoff's ideas were absolutely terrible. The Glacier idea, the Mortis idea, those things were stupid. Letting the NWO get absurdly large was a stupid idea. Some of the things of him not, waiting for big matches on pay-per-view, Goldberg and Hogan, that was dumb. I don't care what you say about the TV networks. That was a big money pay-per-view event that he threw away. With a real finish at that, and threw it away. A lot of his, especially then after his initial idea, he had no second ideas. Like there was nothing for him after the NWO. So you can't say that he was some kind of creative genius. Paul Heyman was much more of a creative genius. Vince was a better creative genius. I'm talking Russo was a bigger creative genius than Bischoff. If you look at all the great bookers, Bischoff shouldn't be on that list. He's not any good. All right. But he created a synergy. Live sports. Catering to the 18 to 49 demographic. With a mix of realism and kayfabe. Taking what you already had and making the most of it. He did a little bit of what everybody else did. With everything that you could say about Paul Heyman, he did a little. Now, he didn't see the potential in other people. That was a huge mistake. Because if he just saw the potential in Benoit and Eddie and Ray, not saying those guys should have been in the main event, but they wouldn't have quit. The reason that they quit is because Bischoff didn't give a shit about most of those guys. He really just kind of pushed his friends, which is another reason why I say his creative is trash. But most of the other things, like he still was targeting kids too. Like he targeted kids too, like Bill Goldberg. Bill Goldberg was a superhero to kids. And he pushed that. He also leaned into some of the pop culture stuff. Like that's what the Mortis and the Glacier thing was about. But he didn't go into the subculture like Paul Heyman did. That's the point of the subculture is that niche audience. Like targeting the niches of the niche audiences is not smart business. And that's what the stuff Paul was doing. So I'm going to go with Bischoff, man. I think Bischoff was more influential than Paul Heyman. I think to the wrestlers themselves, they probably like Paul more because, again, Bischoff was not a creative guy. He was not a wrestler's guy. He was an office guy, But so I think if you ask wrestlers and people who are in the business like Jim Cornette, they would say Paul Heyman, But I think if you're looking at it from a business perspective, it's got to be Eric Bischoff. He was able to do more stuff than Heyman did. And he had access to that money, but he could have turned WCW into ECW if he wanted to. He didn't want to because he knew he couldn't work. And he wasn't stubborn enough to try to make it work. So that's my answer. Let me know what you guys think to this question in the comment section below. Like this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel, donate to the channel. Thank you guys for your time, man. And I'll talk to you guys later.
Skin tone, so why attach yourself and piggyback the wealth you didn't earn or lack yourself? I'm telling you to own up to your own success and failures. It's a reason why these